Welcome everyone to this keynote session of Human Being in an Inhuman Age, a conference hosted by the Hannah Arendt Center for Ethical and Political Thinking, the Human Rights Project, and the Science, Technology, and Society program at Bard College. My name is Thomas Bartscherer. I teach here at Bard in literature, classics, philosophy, and theater. I also teach in the first-year seminar program, and I'm the director of the Language and Thinking program. I'd like first to thank Roger Berkowitz and everyone involved in organizing the conference for inviting me to participate in this important event. And important, I should say, one often goes to conferences that are important to a few people or important to half the people attending. This one, as we've seen from this morning and this afternoon, is important to just about anyone who might walk in the door. And that's exciting to see happen. As many of you know, but I assume some of you may not, the Language and Thinking program, which is attended by all incoming Bard students in the last 3 weeks of August, has for several years focused thematically on the question, what does it mean to be human? So it's particularly exciting for the students at Bard who begin their time here engaging with that question to come to this hall and see a similar issue discussed and debated by their own faculty and by the pageant of extraordinary thinkers and writers that the Hannah Arendt Center has convened for the present conference. This continuity between the themes of the Language and Thinking program and this weekend's conference underscores the vitality of the link between our undergraduate teaching here at Bard and the mission and work of the Arendt Center. So again, I thank Roger Berkowitz and the other organizers for making this happen. It's an honor for me to introduce this evening's keynote speaker. The title of our conference, Human Being in an Inhuman Age, is, I take it, deliberately provocative. What age are we talking about? And what about this age makes one want to call it inhuman? This was addressed this morning by Ray Kurzweil. Same questions. Surely one factor at play here, and it is perhaps the most prominent factor, is what has often been called the digital revolution. And in periods of great transformation, there will occasionally be individuals who, while thoroughly immersed in the tumult of the times, are also among the keenest observers and the most illuminating interpreters of what's going on. Surely our guest tonight is one of those individuals, someone who has documented and deciphered the digital revolution in real time. As she recounts in a recent book, she began teaching at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the days when faculty in the lunchroom were still lamenting the obsolescence of the slide rule. That's for real. She witnessed, in fact, studied the first major effort to introduce personal computers into the undergraduate education at MIT. In 1984, the year you may remember, some of you weren't born yet, the year in which Apple introduced the Macintosh, our guest published the monograph Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit, a prescient and groundbreaking work in the psychology of computation, in which she put forward the claim that computers transform not only what we do, but also how we think, a proposition that would become a leitmotif in her subsequent work. In the decade that followed the publication of Second Self, email was adopted by the general public, America Online was founded, home access to the internet became common, and we saw the birth of the World Wide Web, which we've just been told by Wired magazine is now dead. While that was all still very hot news, in other words, in 1995, our speaker published Life on the Screen, Identity in the Age of the Internet, which was a pioneering work at the time and is still today one of the most influential sociological studies of online life. In the years since, she has edited a series of fascinating volumes for MIT Press, including Evocative Objects, Things We Think With, Falling for Science, Objects in the Mind, and The Inner History of Devices. If you're looking for inspiration for titles, peruse this, our guest's CV. She has concurrently published a steady stream of articles in both scholarly journals and general interest publications, such as the New York Times and the London Review of Books. Her most recent book, an excerpt from which was read by all incoming Bard students this summer during the Language and Thinking program, bears the title, Simulation and Its Discontents. Our speaker has received recognition and support for her work from so many institutions and organizations, I won't begin to name them. She's the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self, the Abby Rockefeller Mauzé Professor of Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT. She has lectured at the World Economic Forum in Davos, at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, Stanford's Institute for the Humanities, the Oxford Internet Institute, the Freud Museum in Vienna. Tonight, she's with us. Please welcome Sherry Turkle.
What a gracious introduction. I'm just kind of listening to that. It's very nice. Thank you very much. Well, this evening I move from the transhumanism of the future, because my subject is going to be the kind of proto-cyborg selves that we live at present. And my goal, which is inspired by Hannah Arendt, who was one of my teachers at the University of Chicago, I studied with her at the Committee on Social Thought, was, as she put it, to start the conversation. Just to start the conversation. And what I'm going to do, as I'll be saying later, is focusing, and here, this is a little bit, and now for something completely different, I'm going to be focusing on discontents, because I think that it's through the study, the analysis, the respect for our discontents, some of which have come up in the question period, I think, that we learn what we miss, what we anticipate missing, and really what we value and cherish. So let me begin by talking about keeping technology busy. From my earliest days at MIT, I began teaching there in 1976, I met the idea, which at the time was utterly new to me, that part of my job would be thinking of ways to keep technology busy. In fall of 1978, Michael Dertouzos, who was then the head of the Laboratory for Computer Science, convened a 2-day retreat at MIT's Endicott House, which is our kind of beautiful country retreat. And it was about the future of the personal computer, at that point really just kind of hitting the streets. At that point, it was clear that what Dertouzos called everyday people would now be able to have computers in their home. Those first computers were just coming on the market, the first ones that were bought, that didn't have to be built. But what would people do with them? It wasn't clear. There was technological potential. And it needed to be put to work. And some of the most brilliant computer scientists in the world, the pioneers of information processing and artificial intelligence, J.C.R. Licklider, Marvin Minsky, Seymour Papert, Robert Fano, were asked to brainstorm on this question. And I was there as a new faculty member who was interested in the study of computers and people. And last night, I went over my notes. Always the ethnographer. I have notebooks and notebooks. I went over my notes from this meeting. Tax preparation, teaching children to program. No one thought that anyone except academics would want to write on computers. Somebody, because you'd have to have a printer, and that would be not as good as having a typewriter where you had the printer built in. Somebody suggested a calendar and was told that this was a dumb idea. And there was agreement that there would be simple games. Everyone tried, all these faculty members. There were no objections to this exercise. Everybody was happy to be at Endicott House for the 2 days. People stayed for the full 2 days and 5 meals, but there weren't a lot of ideas about how we might keep these computers busy. And actually now we know that once computers connected us to each other, once we became tethered to our networks, we really don't need to keep computers busy. They keep us busy, very busy. It's as though we are their killer app. We're on our email, our games, our virtual worlds, our social networks. We text each other at family dinners, while we jog, while we drive, as we push our children on swings in the park. We don't want to intrude on each other, so instead we totally intrude on each other, but we don't do it in real time, some of us sending many thousands of texts a month. And that's not counting the Twitters, the email, the instant messages, social network messages and postings. When we misplace our mobile devices, we become anxious, we become impossible. We archive our own lives, and we upload photos to the web. Indeed, many young people tell me, I'm an ethnographer, I've been studying 15 years of young people and their devices, their mobile devices, just finishing that study now. They tell me they feel guilty and remiss if they don't keep up with this uploading, with this keeping in touch. They tell me that they sleep with their cell phones, and even when their phones are put away, relegated, let's say, to a school locker, they know when their phones are vibrating. They say it's almost like a phantom limb. It is so much a part of them. Technology proposes itself as the architect of our intimacies, and these days there is no coyness about its aspiration to substitute life on the screen for the other kind. The advertising for Second Life, how many of you know what Second Life is? It's a virtual, excellent, right? You're ready for the singularity, right? The advertising for Second Life, which is a virtual world where you get to build an avatar, a home, a house, a family, a history, and a social life, basically says, and this is a quote from what you can get if you just Google Second Life, what is, it says, finally a place to love your body, love your friends, love your life. And on Second Life, a lot of people, at least as represented by their avatars, are richer than they are in First Life, and they're a lot younger, thinner, and better dressed. So here we see that technology, and this is a very important formulation to me, technology is seductive when its affordances meet our human vulnerabilities. And it turns out we are very vulnerable indeed. We are lonely but fearful of intimacy. Connectivity offers us the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. We can't get enough of each other if we can have each other at a distance in amounts that we can control, like Goldilocks. We want it not too close, not too far, just right. We want connection made to measure. We want the ability to hide from each other even as we're constantly connected to each other. To put it too simply, and the phone company will tell you that I am right, we would rather text than talk. A simple story makes this point. Again, it's a professional deformation. I'm a collector of stories, so I'm going to tell you quite a few of them. And this story was told in her own words by a harried mom of about 40, in her mid-40s, who I interviewed, and this is what she said to me. I needed to find a new nanny. When I interview nannies, I like to go where they live so that I can see them in their environment, not just in my environment. So I made an appointment to interview Ronnie, who had applied for the job. I show up at her apartment and her housemate answers the door. She's a young woman around 21, texting on her BlackBerry. Her thumbs are bandaged. I look at them pained, and I try to be sympathetic. That must hurt. But she just shrugs. With tiny thumb splints, she explains that she's still able to text. I tell her I'm here to speak with Ronnie. This is her job interview. Could she please knock on Ronnie's bedroom door? The girl with the bandaged thumbs looks surprised. Oh, no, she says, I would never do that. That would be intrusive. I'll text her. And so she sends a text message to Ronnie, no more than 15 feet away. So to paraphrase Thoreau, where do we live and what do we live for in our new tethered lives? People love these new technologies of connection. They've made parents and children feel more secure. They've revolutionized business, education, scholarship, and medicine. It's not an accident that corporate America has chosen to name cell phones after candies, chocolate, strawberry, vanilla. There's a sweetness to them. They have changed how we date and how we travel. The global reach of connectivity can make the most isolated outpost into a center of learning and economic activity. The word apps summons the pleasures of tasks accomplished, some that only recently we would not have dreamed possible. Beyond all of this, connectivity offers new possibilities for experimenting with identity, and particularly in adolescence, and this is something I've written about at length, a sense of free space, what Erik Erikson once called the moratorium. This is a time relatively consequence-free. Nothing is, of course, really consequence-free, but relatively consequence-free for doing what adolescents need to do, fall in and out of love with people, fall in and out of love with ideas. Real life does not always provide this kind of space. Most high school students are in kind of a pre-professional school for getting into college. They don't have that sense of lack of confidence. But for a period of time, the internet seemed to provide that kind of space. But no handle cranks in any of these theories of stages, whether it's Freud or Erikson or Piaget. There's no handle that cranks. There's no gear that turns, that graduates us from one stage of life and move on to another. So adults, too, use the internet as a useful place for experimentation and identity workshop. And yet this evening, I'm not renouncing all of that work that I've done that makes this point about the moratorium, about the ongoing possibility to live with the internet as an identity workshop, but I'm going, as I say, to talk about discontents. So why discontents? They point us to what we miss, to what we hold dear, and what we don't want to lose. They point us to our sacred spaces. So I'm going to try to give nostalgia a good name, particularly the nostalgia of the young, who, according to my research, often reach for something that they never fully knew as they dream of their future. They reach, for example, to the idea of telephone calls made, as one 18-year-old put it, sitting down and giving each other full attention. Teenagers, after all, grew up in a culture of distraction. They remember that their parents were on cell phones when they were pushed on swings as toddlers. Now their parents text at the dinner table and don't look up from their BlackBerries when they come home from the end of school pickup. From the moment this generation met technology, it was the competition, and significantly young people imagine a world in which information is not taken from them automatically, just as the cost of doing business. One 16-year-old, a young man, tells me that when he really wants privacy, he uses a payphone. And he specifies that he uses the kind, and here I'm quoting, the kind that takes coins. And that's really hard to find in Boston. Another says that she feels safe because who would care about me and my little life? These are not empowering mantras. In the past, I've spoken about computers and the people with the metaphor of a second self. We used the computer as a mirror of mind. We were able to project ourselves as characters in online worlds. But today, the metaphor of the second self, again, not renouncing it, but it absolutely does not go far enough. These days, our always-on you connectivity requires us to speak of a new state of the self itself, the tethered self. What are some of its characteristics? First of all, it has new confusions. New confusions. As we instant message, email, text, and Twitter, technology redraws the boundaries between intimacy and solitude. We talk of getting rid of our emails as though these notes were so much excess baggage. Teenagers avoid the telephone, fearful that it reveals too much. Besides, the telephone, again, quote, takes too long. They would rather text than talk. Adults, too, choose keyboards over the human voice. Tethered to technology, people are shaken when that world unplugged does not signify or does not satisfy. Very typical of the people I interview after an evening of avatar-to-avatar talk in a network game. They feel at one moment in possession of a full social life and in the next curiously isolated in a kind of tenuous complicity with strangers. We build a following on Facebook, and then we wonder to what degree our followings are friends. We recreate ourselves as online persona in games or in virtual worlds and give ourselves new bodies, homes, jobs, and romances. Yet suddenly, in the half-light of virtual community, we may feel utterly alone. As we distribute ourselves, do we abandon ourselves? Some people tell me they feel no sense of having connected after hours of communication. Some report feelings of near communion when they thought they were hardly paying any attention at all. Distinctions blur, we're not sure who to count on. Virtual friendships and worlds offer connection with uncertain claims to commitment. We know this, and yet the emotional charge of the online world is very high. People talk about it as the place for hope, the place where something new will come to them, the place where loneliness can be defeated. A woman in her late 60s talks about her new iPhone. She says, "It's like having a little Times Square in my pocketbook, all lights, all the people I could meet." People are lonely. Connectivity is seductive. But what do we have now that we have what we say, what we want, now that we have what technology makes easy? We can communicate when we wish, and we can disengage at will. We can choose not to see or hear our interlocutors. What we have is a technology that makes it easy to hide. That is, it makes it easy to hide from each other, but not so easy to hide from authority, corporate or political, and more on this later. So let me say a word about hiding. Mandy, 13, tells me, "I hate the phone and I never listen to voicemail." She presents a downbeat account of a telephone call. She says, "You wouldn't want to call because then you'd have to get into a conversation. And conversation," she says, "well, that's something where you only want to have them when you want to have them." For Mandy, this would be, quote, "almost never." Conversation is almost always too prying, it takes too long, and it's impossible to say goodbye. Stan, 16, will not speak on the telephone except when his mother makes him call a relative. And he says, "When you text, you have more time to think about what you're writing. On the telephone, too much would show." This is not a teen problem. In corporations, among friends, within academic departments, people readily admit that they would rather leave a voicemail or send an email than talk face to face. You know who you are. Some who say, "I live my life on my BlackBerry," are forthright about avoiding the real-time commitment of a phone call. Here we see technologies being used to dial down human contact, or perhaps it'd be more accurate to say to kind of titrate their nature and extent. People are comforted by being in touch with a lot of people whom they also keep at bay. We become entrained in a vicious circle that doesn't go exactly according to plan. We imagine that email and texting will give us more control over our time and emotional exposure, but we send out a lot, and so we get even more back. So many, in fact, that the idea of communicating with anything but quick staccato texts seems almost too exhausting. Shakespeare might have said, "We are consumed with that which we are nourished by." So what are these anxieties of disconnection? Why is it so hard to give this up? With constant connectivity comes new anxieties of disconnection, anxieties of not having it. In interviews with young and all, there's a kind of panic. I feel people genuinely terrified of being cut off from the grid. People tell me that the loss of a cell phone can, quote, "feel like a death." One woman says that without the phone, I felt that I had lost my mind. I mean, you see the beginning of a sort of cyborg sensibility, sort of on the ground, as people use these technologies. A danger even to ourselves. We insist on the right to send text messages from our moving cars and object to rules that would limit the practice. In Massachusetts, it's illegal to text in the car. I drove up here. This rule is not yet being followed in Massachusetts. Caught up in the new volume and velocity of communication, we feel overwhelmed across the generations. A lot of talk about digital natives, the young people, and digital, immigrants, the rest of us. In my studies, the natives and the immigrants have a lot more in common than the kind of common narrative would have it. So I interview Sanjay Xvi. We talk for an hour between two of his high school class periods. At the beginning of our conversation, he takes his mobile phone out of his pocket. He turns it off. At the end of our conversation, about an hour, he turns the phone back on, and he looks at me ruefully, almost embarrassed. He's received over 100 text messages as we were speaking. I'm incredulous, so he shows me the phone. Some are from a group of close friends who are trying to organize a small concert. Some are from a girlfriend who says is having a meltdown. He feels a lot of pressure to reply, and so he picks up his books and his laptop, his book bag, so he can find a place to be alone and set himself to the task. As he says goodbye to me, as though this hour with me, somehow off the grid was like vacation, he adds, not speaking particularly to me, but more to himself, as an afterthought to the conversation we've just had, I can't imagine doing this when I get older. And then more quietly, how long do I have to continue doing this? Adults, too, are overwhelmed. We measure success by calls made, emails answered, texts replied to, contacts reached, and yet we confront a paradox. We insist that our world is increasingly complex, yet we've created a communications culture that has decreased the time available for us to sit and think uninterrupted. And we communicate with each other in ways that ask for almost instantaneous responses. We don't allow ourselves the space to explain the complicated problems that we insist we're facing. We turn to technology to help us find time, but we end up spending more time with technology and less with each other. And there again is the vicious circle. Technology makes us busier than ever, and so we seek online relationships that seem to have less emotional risk and that can be customized to our wants. The besieged self retreats to online places, and here again is the vicious circle, where things seem simpler. We cycle through them in the real world at a rapid pace, so fast that this rapid cycling becomes a kind of co-presence. We live a simultaneity of lives, the interleaving of romance, work, and a shout-out to 6-year-olds. If you're at the park, you're there with your phone, you're on Second Life, you're with your kid, you're doing business, you're doing pleasure, I interviewed a guy who was there, on Second Life with his girlfriend, pushing his 6-year-old, and he talks about his Second Life marriage, because he's a married guy, but he has a wife on Second Life as well. He talks about his Second Life marriage as an essential part of his life mix. And so I'd never heard the phrase before, and I asked him about the expression, and he explains to me that the life mix is the mashup of what you have on and offline. One has moved from multitasking to multi-lifing. And increasingly, although admittedly at MIT I live in the land of the techno-sophisticated, I'm increasingly given business cards that include people's real life names, their Facebook handles, and the name of their avatar or avatars on Second Life. What about growing up tethered? Most of my work over the past decade has focused on adolescents, the cohort that grew up online and with cell phones, and I use cell phones to mean the smartphones that are kind of like what used to be called little computers. Through the prism of this adolescent experience, we see future sensibilities unfolding. So what are the highlights of this future sensibility as I see it, as much as any ethnographer can see it from what's on the ground now? First of all, there are new tensions in adolescent separation and individuation. Connectivity helps adolescents deal with the difficulties of separation, particularly from parents. When you leave home with a cell phone, you're not as cut off as you were in previous generations. Separation can be worked out in little baby steps. But now you may find yourself texting your mother 15 times a day, which is not out of the norm. You may find yourself comfortable having a grown-up on tap, and your friends, too, are always around. You come to enjoy the feeling of never having to be alone. A 19-year-old says to me, I say it's my alarm clock, this is a college freshman, I say it's my alarm clock, that's why I always sleep with it, but it's more than that. I just like to have it close. Feelings of being a bit stranded used to be a normal part of adolescence, a step toward being comfortable with autonomy. Connectivity makes it possible to bypass this feeling. Questions about autonomy take a new shape if we are together, even when we're alone. Actually, I've just finished a new book about this kind of stuff. It's called Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. You know, think of it as the bowling alone of techno life. So here's my most important point. I think speakers owe it to you to tell you in a lecture of this length, when they're at the money line. So if you take one thing, the day is late, the room is warm. If you take one thing from what I've said, please let it be this. Because I worked very hard to be able to come up with this formulation, interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teenagers, and really spent a tremendous amount of time. It took 15 years to write this book to make sure that if you're a qualitative researcher, there's a great burden, since you don't have numbers, to make sure that, how would you put it, that the bench is deep, that you're not just kind of generalizing from one kid who, said it beautifully. So from a deep bench, here's a formulation I have. The teenagers have gone from saying stuff like, I have a feeling I want to make a call, to I want to have a feeling I need to send a text. Let me say that again. They've gone from I have a feeling I want to make a call to I want to have a feeling I need to send a text. So I was trained as a psychologist in the 1960s and 1970s. This was a time in American psychology, and I'm not particularly proud of this. It was a time when women weren't included in studies of psychological processes, and that seemed completely natural to me. Fortunately, it didn't seem natural to Carol Gilligan, but at the time, it was just the way things happened. Another thing that was very problematic, but true, was that autonomy and strong boundaries were taken as the reliable signs of a successfully maturing adolescent. Now, in this kind of autonomy-based version of development, the maturing self has a feeling, considers it, and then decides whether to share it. So sharing a feeling is a deliberate thing. It's a movement toward intimacy. Now, this description was always a fiction in several important ways. For one thing, this autonomy gold standard validated a style that was culturally male. Women, and indeed many men, have an emotional style that defines itself not through boundaries but through relationships. Furthermore, adolescent conversations are by nature exploratory, and this in healthy ways. I'm the kind of writer who doesn't know what I think until I start to write it. I learn what I think by looking at what I write. And the years of identity formation, similarly, can be a time of learning what you think by hearing what you say. But even given these caveats, and please hear me, I'm aware of these caveats. There was never this golden age when all these autonomous, bubbles, walked around. Even given these caveats, when we think about maturation, the notion of a bounded self has its virtues, if only as a metaphor. It suggests, sensibly, that before we can forge successful life partnerships, it is perhaps helpful to have a sense of who we are. But the gold standard tarnishes if a phone is always at hand. Now technology makes it easy to express one's emotions while they're being formed. It enables an emotional style in which we don't credit our feelings until they're communicated. Put otherwise, there's every opportunity to form a thought by sending out for comments. I interviewed Julia, 16, who turns texting into a kind of polling. And here's what she says to me. If I'm upset, right as I feel upset, I text a couple of my friends just because I know that they'll be there and they can comfort me. If something exciting happens, I know that they'll be there to be excited with me and stuff like that. So I definitely feel emotions when I'm texting as I'm texting. Even before I get upset and I know that I have that feeling that I'm going to start crying, I'll pull up my friend on my phone and say I'll tell them what I'm feeling and I need to talk to them or see them. After Julia sends out a text, she is uncomfortable until she gets one back. She says, I'm always looking for that text back that says, oh, I'm sorry, or oh, that's great. Without this feedback, she says, it's hard to calm down. For Julia, getting a response is not about politeness. She says of those she texts, you want them there because you need them. If they're not there, if the responses don't come, she moves on with her nascent feelings, but she does not move on alone. She says, I go to another friend and tell them. And note that beautiful little Freudian slip that was her, or information processing error, that was hers, not mine, when she says, when I have that feeling that I'm going to start crying, I'll pull out my friend on my phone and say etc. The friend, the phone, the pulling out, it's all kind of merged in her mind. So things have moved from I have a feeling I want to make a call to I want a feeling I need to send a text. What is not being cultivated is the ability to be alone, to reflect on one's emotion in solitude, to gather oneself. David Reisman, writing in the mid-1950s, remarked on the American turn from an inner to an other directed sense of self. Reisman, who was one of my teachers, could not have foreseen, I don't think he could have foreseen, how technology would be in a position to raise other directedness to a higher power. At the moment of beginning to have a thought or feeling, we can have it pre-validated. Online connections may be brief, but more is not necessarily desired. It is enough to have someone be there. Technology doesn't cause. I'm not a sort of technological determinist. Technology doesn't do this, but it encourages a sensibility where the validation of a feeling becomes part of establishing this. In Reisman's terms, this is a turn to a hyper-other directedness. In more psychoanalytic terms, because that's my own training, our contact or buddy list has become a list of spare parts. Psychoanalysts call them part objects that support the fragile adolescent self. And indeed, to support fragile adult selves, but when we use people as part objects, we reduce them. Because using somebody as a part object, what some psychoanalysts call a self-object, we reduce them as we turn them to our own purposes. We take what we need. It is not the way to a real relationship. Which brings me to another characteristic of where we are today, which is what I call the anxiety of always. As they trial balloon their feelings, teenagers are always on the network, always leaving a trace. It has taken a generation for people to begin to understand that on the internet, the words delete and erase are metaphorical. The internet never forgets. Over time, and I say this with much anxiety, living with an electronic shadow begins to feel so natural that it seems to disappear. It disappears, that is, until a moment of crisis, a lawsuit, a scandal, an investigation. Then, if you're Tiger Woods, you're caught short, you turn around, and you see that you have been the instrument of your own surveillance. We're all the instruments of our own surveillance. Now, it's true, when I teach this kind of theme, when I speak about this theme, there is someone, and we're going to have questions, there's someone, let me anticipate you, who will raise their hand and say, privacy is historically a relatively new idea. And I say, you're right, but it has well served our modern notions of intimacy and democracy. What is intimacy without privacy? What is democracy without privacy? For many, the idea that, quote, and now I'm paraphrasing now, but actually I'm quoting the head of Google, the head of Sun Microsystems, Eric Schmidt recently said that privacy was dead, and at 21 everyone will need to change their name because there will be no way to kind of take back their childhoods. Privacy is dead, so just get over it. I mean, these are kind of this is out there in the culture. The idea that we're all being observed all the time, so who needs privacy, is a commonplace. But it is a state of mind with a cost. It is being marketed as a commonplace. It has become a commonplace, but it is a state of mind with a cost. I belong to this organization. This you probably have not heard of. It's called the Webby organization, the Webby Awards. Everybody hear of the Webbies? Oh my God. So I'm a Webby judge. I get to go to the Webby Gala. Kind of it used to be the Academy Awards for sort of nerds, but now it's become very glamorous. And at a Webby Awards ceremony, which is an event to recognize the best and most influential websites, I am reminded of just how costly it is. One year that I attend the Webbies, the ceremonies take place just as the government wiretapping scandal is dominating the press, and when the question of illegal eavesdropping comes up, a common reaction, I mean, it comes up in every conversation, it's kind of a weekend event, a common reaction among the gathered Webberati is to turn this issue into a non-issue. Everybody's talking, again I'm quoting, the commonplaces of this field, all information is good information, information wants to be free, and my personal favorite, because I think it really is I was going to say proto-fascistic, but perhaps some of you will think that's too strong. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. At a pre-awards, Eric Schmidt says, if you're worried about privacy, just be good. At a pre-awards cocktail party, one Webby luminary speaks to me with animation about the spying controversy. To my surprise, he cites Michel Foucault's writing on the panopticon. This is a very haute theoretical Webby person. He cites Michel Foucault's writing on the panopticon to explain why he is not worried about privacy concerns on the internet. And I listen in morbid fascination to what follows. I'm taken aback because, after all, to remind you, for Foucault, the task of the modern state is to reduce its need for actual surveillance by creating a citizenry that will watch itself. A disciplined citizen minds the rules. Foucault wrote about Jeremy Bentham's design for Panopticon because it captured how such a citizenry might be shaped. The Panopticon is a wheel-like structure with an observer at its hub, and in such a structure, one develops the sense of always being watched, whether or not one is being watched. So if the structure is a prison, for example, inmates know that potentially a guard can always see them. In the end, the architecture constructs self-surveillance. Always available for scrutiny, everyone turns an eye on themselves in the Panopticon society. And by analogy, getting back to the Webbies, by analogy, says my Webby conversation partner, a technological guru, on the internet, quote, someone might, and I'm taking like notes, I'm saying, I'm going to take this down, someone might always be watching, so it doesn't matter if from time to time someone is. As long as you're not doing anything wrong, you are safe. In the hands of this technology guru, Foucault's critical take on disciplinary society had become a justification for the United States government using the internet to spy on its citizens. All around us at the cocktail party, there are nods of assent. And variants of this way of thinking, very common in the technology community, you don't need privacy if you have nothing to hide, is becoming a default position among high school and college students. So for all the talk, and here I get to my discontents, for all the talk of a generation empowered by the net, we've heard the word empowered a lot. When young people talk about internet privacy, what I hear is resignation and a sense of impotence. When I talk to teenagers about the certainty that their privacy will be invaded, my thoughts go back to my very different experience growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s. We've heard about the pickles. Who talked about the pickles that you can no longer get? We talked about the pickles you can no longer get because okay? And let me now talk to you about the mail delivery twice a day that you can no longer get. As the McCarthy era swirled around them, my grandparents were anxious. Having the government spy on its citizens was something too familiar from the old world. As a young child, I lived with my grandparents in a large apartment building in Brooklyn, and every morning my mother went off to work. She was divorced. We lived with my grandparents, and she went off to work, and my grandmother and I went downstairs to the mailboxes. And it feels like almost every morning she would say to me, as if it had never come up before. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about one's memories, that, it seems to be replaying on a kind of endless loop, but I really do feel that it was every morning she said this, as though it had never come up before. In America, no one can look at your mail. It's a federal offense. It's a federal offense. That's how she talked. It's a federal offense. Now, that particular, I hardly have heard anyone use that term ever since. It's a federal offense. That's what she told me. That's the beauty of this country. She also talked like that. That's the beauty of this country. From the earliest age, my civics lessons at the mailboxes joined together privacy and civil liberties. I think of how different things are for children today who accommodate to the idea that their email and messages are shareable and unprotected. And I think of the internet guru at the Webby Awards who, citing Foucault, and I promise you, with no irony, accepts the idea that the internet has fulfilled the dream of the panopticon and sums up his political position about the net. The way to deal is just be good. But sometimes a citizenry should not simply be good. You have to leave space for dissent, real dissent, but you need to leave technical space, like a sacrosanct mailbox, and you need to leave mental space. I've spent a career trying to, I wouldn't say prove, but demonstrate, argue, that these two are intertwined, the technical space and the mental space. We make our technologies, and they, in turn, make and shape us. My grandmother made me an American citizen, a civil libertarian, a defender of individual rights, in an apartment lobby in Brooklyn. I'm not sure where to take my 19-year-old daughter, who still thinks that Looped, and this is the application for the iPhone that uses the GPS capability of the iPhone to show her where her friends are. She says it seems creepy, but she notes that it would be hard to keep it off her phone if all her friends have it, and she says they would think I have something to hide. In democracy, perhaps we all need to begin with the assumption that everyone has something to hide. A zone of private action and self-reflection, a zone that needs to be protected no matter what our techno-enthusiasms. I am haunted by that boy who tells me that when he needs to make a private call, he tries to find a payphone, and how hard it is to find the coin kind in Boston, where almost all the payphones need a credit card. And I'm haunted by the girl who sums up her reaction to losing online privacy by saying, "Who would care about me and my little life?" So I learned to be a citizen at the Brooklyn mailboxes. To me, opening up a conversation about privacy and civil society is not romantically nostalgic. It is not Luddite in the least. It seems like a healthy part of democracy, defining its sacred spaces. Thank you very much. My goodness, thank you. May I take some questions? I'll just take the question. Just raise your hand.
Let me just
sure.
Say, we have, according to the greatest giving in Roger, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
So I would ask that you please keep your questions brief and to the point.
Tracy.
Sure, thank you. Does the argument about autonomy imply that for those of us who, let us say, were autonomous...
Are of a certain age?
Of a certain age, in other words, let's assume we can say autonomous, even though that's a question, before the development of this technology, that there is actually an important epistemological gulf between that generation and the other?
Yes. Yes, I think that this is a very big, as I said, the digital natives, digital immigrants argument is made more strongly, I think, because it's so cute, than it usually, I think, is justified. But in the case of something as fundamental as kind of how one feels about the boundaries of self, I think that this stuff gets laid down very early, and I think you see a shift. Yes, I think this is a fundamental. I don't think of it as an epistemological gulf. I think of it as a gulf in psychological sensibility. Yes.
Towards the beginning of your talk, you used the phrase real time, I think, to characterize negatively virtual interactions as not taking place in real time. Towards the end, you use an example from the mailroom with its implication of receiving letters, which, of course, are also not in real time, but more intimate. Can you say a bit more about?
No, my whole letter story had to do with the locked mailboxes and my grandmother's belief that she was living in a world where the privacy of her communications was privileged, and in fact supported by the full weight, that federal offense weight, which was for her an amazing thing, of the federal government. So the mailboxes for me were an image, or meant to be in that story, an image of kind of what it's like to grow up. And this perhaps is the epistemological, what it's like to grow up thinking that there really is a zone of privileged private communication. The real-time part of my conversation really is my trying to muse about the phenomenon of people wanting to time shift communication because they're too busy to talk to each other. They'd rather text or email each other to set up an appointment when they can meet face-to-face to talk to each other. But in fact, that appointment, I have interview after interview with people who did not grow up in this regime of communication and talk about using email to set up appointments, but appointments that might be 2 months away, and then sort of they're not using the phone in the interim. I mean, all the research shows that we use our phones for talking to 4 to 6 people to whom we talk a lot, but the phone is less and less. I mean, my phone, my landline only rings for money, people, or money, asking me for money, not giving me money, asking me for money. I mean, and then the cell phone, is who you talk to your kind of intimates with. But it's this, and the reason I like that Shakespeare line, which I must say it's a little pretentious to use, but I couldn't resist throwing it in. I mean, that notion of we're being consumed by that which we thought would nourish us. I mean, we're all the time texting and we're always communicating in order to sort of not have to take the time to communicate in real time. Now, there are things about real-time communication that are, different and special, and I'm interested in how quickly, across the generations, we've learned to move away from it. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask if you've come across any research that doesn't just focus on the sort of Anglo-American or North American context. I have a lot of experience living in Italy specifically, but in Latin countries more general. And the interesting thing about cell phones there is that they're actually a way of doing what comes naturally, in a sense, to those cultures, which is just have more conversations. In other words, it seems to me that in a non-Protestant dominated culture that imagines society and culture as a collection of monistic individuals, the dynamics of the interface of the relationship between the cell phone technology, the texting and stuff like that, to the point where, for instance, when I tell my relatives and friends in Italy that I use Facebook a lot, they sort of assume I have nothing to do. And then I explain to them that it's actually a work tool now, that we live in a post-email world where... This
is how you justify Facebook?
Yeah. Well, it's...
Can I use that?
You can use it, but it's actually
true.
All of my Facebook friends are colleagues. And, a lot of sort of interactions happen on Facebook in that regard. But that's beside the point. The point being that there's a picture of communication, and that sort of sets the context of what intersubjective communication is.
That's very interesting. I mean, I did this study while I was raising a child, and my rule was if it wasn't on the East Coast of the United States, I wouldn't study it. So I'm very modest about what I'm reporting is the East Coast of the United States, but across cultural, ethnic, and socioeconomic divides. But I am reporting these. So it's coal towns and it's upper class suburbs, but it's in the East Coast of the United States. Now, most of the studies that I'm familiar with are done in Japan, Korea, and there, what I'm describing is like taken to a higher power, according to these studies. It kind of a constant texting and so forth. People are sort of never. I mean, it's a very much a text culture. I don't actually know about the Italian and the French situation. It's a very interesting question. But certainly in the Asian Rim, it's my story, but more. Let me do this side. Okay, yeah.
Yes, I would commend you on a very human level.
Isn't it amazing to be commended as a human? And in this group.
Especially in the face of all this exponential inhumanity we've been exposed to today. Thank you very much. Email, voicemail, and texting are kind of technologically neutral in that we can allow them to build up and handle them all at once. Why don't we do this, and will we learn to do this?
I don't understand.
Well,
what do you mean technologically neutral?
Oh, well, I just mean that rather than always responding to an email as it comes in, let it build up. And this will helpfully keep you from being tethered to your machine. Just let all the stuff build up, handle it, rest 5 hours, let it build up, handle it, let it rest 5 hours. And why don't we do that? And will we learn to do that?
Well, this is interesting. There's actually, I'm not, as you can probably tell from my references, I'm not a big neurobiology person. It's just out of my area of expertise, and so I just think it's better to talk on things where I have sort of value added. But it turns out that in the area of why don't we do that on your question, there is some neuroscience that calls into play. The brain has kind of seeking behavior and is rewarded for seeking behavior. So every time you make a new search, every time you answer an email, every time that ping goes off and you respond to it, your brain rewards you with a neurochemical, which is part of what makes multitasking feel so good, because you do feel as though you're accomplishing more and more because you're kind of self-stimulating to feel that even as your performance degrades. So I would argue that actually there is a kind of vicious, let's not call it virtuous, let's call it vicious or virtuous depending on your point of view, cycle where people don't wait 5 hours and let it build up and then use it. I mean, why not get a letter, read them at the end of the week, and then have the rest of the week to to not be in communication. I mean, the point of this is that it's the constant communication that becomes the pleasure in itself. I have a rap that I didn't include in my remarks, but it's me share it with you about. I feel very strongly that we should not think of this as addiction. And I realize that some of my remarks point, in particular talk about neurochemicals, point in the direction of this as a kind of addiction. I would just say how I feel about that, is that no matter how much the metaphor of addiction seems to capture the phenomena that I'm talking about, and this in particular, we cannot afford to use the metaphor of addiction. Because addiction to a substance can only be treated in one way. You have to get rid of the substance. We are not going to throw out our cell phones. We are not going to, lose email, not text, give it up. We're not going to give it up. So it only depresses people and makes them feel impotent and hopeless to have this metaphor of addiction is kind of the only one that's bandied about what this is about and what to do about it. I mean, we have to learn to live with this in a way that, and here this is a very Arendtian, I think, position, we have to learn to live with this in a way that suits our human purposes, which brings every technology, confronts us with the question of what our human purposes are. Every technology is an opportunity to redefine those human purposes. And I really, speak to you tonight and write about this in the spirit of marking that time, that moment of opportunity. One more question.
Your talk made me think a lot about my 13-year-old niece, and specifically the conversation that we've had where she's confided in me about her and her friends and their sexuality and their openness with sexuality. And I'm wondering, in terms of the elimination of privacy, what have you come across in terms of the obliteration of morality? Or
the obliteration of what?
Morality. The idea that things that might have been shameful or immoral, in a world where we all see each other now, or in this generation where they all see each other, is it no longer, quote-unquote, bad?
Right. Well, this is, the internet and has many stories, kind of foundational myths, sustaining myths, and I call them myths not because they're not true, but they function as a kind of, in the same sense that the singularity is like the rapture, there are sort of foundational myths in the sense that everything changes after it. I mean, you either believe it or not, but I mean, it's kind of this game changer, and you have to believe in it. There is a potent myth, and again, I say myth because it's a kind of sustaining belief, that the lack of privacy will mean greater tolerance in the future. Now, to date, there is no evidence that that is the way it's experienced by kids as they grow up. In other words, that boy who was revealed, that young college student at Rutgers who was revealed as being a homosexual, did not say to himself, but in the internet age, all acts are open, spied on the net, and I look forward to a greater age of tolerance because who cares, it's on the net. I mean, this is not, we don't see it, it doesn't happen developmentally. So we know it doesn't happen developmentally, and the question is whether societally that will happen. And there, if anything, I would say, this conference takes place, of course, as all conferences do, in a bubble where it doesn't look outside to what's going on the front page of the newspaper. There's not evidence that it's taking place right now societally as people go to vote and express their vote for candidates that express their moral views in the age of the internet. So I'm not pessimistic about. I'm optimistic that we're going to. That we need to think about this, have the conversation, and confront this, which I don't think, by the way, we've done. I think we've kind of, very sympathetic with David Rose when he says, so get a grip, pull up your socks, talk about this, And I don't think we talk about it enough. I think we've just kind of let it happen. Kevin Kelly just wrote a book called What Technology Wants, and well, what do we want? Is that really, do we need to have common cause? Is that just one of our foundational myths? Or are there some things, as I'm suggesting, that technology may want? Technology may want it very bad, but we don't want to give it to technology. But to your question, I don't see, I think that these myths that help us feel better, and this is a very, very powerful one, that the lack of privacy means that there will be in the future there'll be, increasing tolerance and anything goes. It certainly developmentally is not how teenagers feel when they're caught doing something that they're not comfortable with. And it certainly, it's kind of a justification for bullying in many cases. And I think it remains to be seen whether on a social level we'll see this new tolerance. And although I'm optimistic about our ability to confront these things, I'm very, very pessimistic that they will work themselves out because technology will want us to have a more tolerant society. Thank you very much.